There comes a moment when you stop responding, not because you are angry, but because you have finally perceived the structural reality of the situation. Most people never notice the exact second the psychic energy shifts, but it happens during an ordinary interaction, perhaps while sitting across a table from someone who is weaving a complex narrative designed to secure your validation. You look at them, and for the first time, you do not see a friend, a partner, or a colleague in need of support. You see an intricate network of defenses, a persona desperately trying to maintain its inflation, and a deep, unacknowledged hunger for control. In that precise instant, your emotional receptivity, which previously functioned as a porous boundary, allowing you to absorb and carry their unspoken tension, completely detaches. The silence that follows is not a tactical withdrawal or a passive, aggressive punishment, but the natural consequence of a profound internal realization. You realize that to speak, to correct, or to argue would only provide more psychic material for their psychological machinery to consume. This sudden emotional detachment feels cold, almost terrifyingly so, because it violates the unwritten relational contract you have honored for years. You have likely been operating under the assumption that your heightened sensitivity was a tool for mutual understanding, a gift that allowed you to bridge the gap between two psyches. But when you look closely at a recent disagreement, perhaps a moment where someone politely but coldly shifted the blame for their own anxiety onto your shoulders, you begin to see the hidden mechanism at work. Your willingness to feel what others refuse to feel has not been a source of connection, but a form of psychological accommodation. Human beings adapt to access, and by allowing your psychic boundary to remain entirely open, you have unknowingly permitted others to use your emotional field as a repository for their own rejected shadow material. When you finally perceive this pattern, the illusions that sustain the relationship begin to dissolve, leaving behind a stark, uncomfortable clarity that immediately isolates you from the collective performance. What interests me is the secret machinery beneath this specific form of silence, which is actually a sudden refusal to participate in a shared projection. For a long time, your identity may have been bound up in the role of the intuitive container, the one who understands, who forgives, who deciphered the subtle shifts in a room before anyone else spoke. This role is a seductive persona because it mimics moral superiority, but it carries a devastating psychological cost. When you sit in a room and watch a person become overly polite, using a facade of reasonableness to mask a profound resentment, your instinct notices the contradiction long before your consciousness accepts it. You are seeing their shadow, the disowned impulses of envy or aggression that they cannot admit to themselves. The moment you truly comprehend that their words are merely a performance designed to protect their ego defense, the psychic energy you use to invest in their narrative returns to you. You become quiet because you understand that any intervention on your part would only reinforce their illusion, as they are not relating to you at all, but rather to the version of you they learned how to navigate. Consider the symbolic image of a lamp burning in an empty room, casting long, unmoving shadows against the walls while the house around it remains completely dark. This is the state of heightened consciousness when it first detaches from an unconscious relational loop. You are fully awake to the dynamics of the room, yet you are entirely alone within that awareness. This realization often occurs during a mundane event, such as a delayed reply to a message or a subtle shift in someone's tone when you decline to validate their complaints. In the past, you might have overthought the interaction, analyzing their motives or attempting to repair the sudden coolness in the air. Now, however, the unconscious identification is broken. You see that their sudden coldness is not a reflection of your inadequacy, but a defensive reaction to your refusal to carry their projected pain. They call you distant or strange when your awareness reveals their conformity, yet your silence is merely the container for a truth they are not yet equipped to face. This experience forces a confrontation with your own unconscious motives, because you must ask yourself why you allowed your emotional boundaries to remain porous for so long. The truth is often uncomfortable, revealing that your sensitivity was frequently used to negotiate safety in an environment dominated by unconscious power exchanges. By absorbing the tension of others, you attempted to control the emotional climate, mistakenly believing that keeping everyone else regulated would protect you from abandonment. When this illusion collapses, you are left with the raw reality of the collective psyche, which demands a high degree of conformity and a willingness to participate in mutual self-deception. Your silence is the first indication that you are no longer willing to pay this psychological rent. It marks the beginning of a deeper descent into the objective reality of human nature, where you no longer look at people through the lens of what they could be, but see them precisely as they are choosing to manifest in the present moment. This withdrawal of psychic energy inevitably triggers an intense individuation pressure, a demand from the psyche to stand firmly within your own objective reality without seeking external confirmation. When you refuse to participate in the unspoken power exchanges of a relationship, the other person often experiences your silence as a profound threat to their ego defense. I have often observed that when a performance loses its audience, the performer does not examine their behavior. Rather, they increase the intensity of the performance. They may accuse you of being cold, selfish, or arrogant, projecting their own unacknowledged shadow material onto your quietness because your independence exposes their deep dependency. In a workplace interaction or a family gathering, this looks like a sudden, sharp criticism disguised as constructive feedback, or a deliberate omission from a shared conversation. Your instinct recognizes the hidden malice beneath their politeness, but instead of rushing to defend yourself, you simply observe the mechanism. You realize that their criticism is actually an inverted confession of their own vulnerability. The real burden of this consciousness is that it leaves you completely exposed to the unlived life within yourself, the parts of your own shadow that you chose to ignore while you were preoccupied with managing the psychological climates of others. For years, you may have been a helper who could not admit exhaustion, or a calm person who could not admit rage, using your emotional receptivity to maintain a morally pure persona. Now, as the illusions of those relationships collapse, you are forced to confront the hidden resentment that accumulated every time you accepted a projected blame that did not belong to you. This realization is rarely dramatic. It is more like walking into a house with one forbidden room and finally turning the key. Inside that room, you do not find a monster, but rather your own refused intelligence, your disowned ambition, and the fierce instinctual strength you suppressed in order to remain cooperative. Your silence deepens because you are no longer using your psychic energy to hold the door shut against your own darkness. Returning to the image of the lamp burning in an empty room, you begin to see that the light does not exist to alter the room. but simply to illuminate its dimensions. Human beings do not change because we point out their contradictions. They only change when the cost of maintaining their persona becomes psychologically unsustainable. When you stop providing the emotional validation that cushions their ego, you force them to encounter their own internal emptiness, a confrontation most people will avoid at all costs. You see this when a person abruptly changes the subject after a moment of prolonged, honest silence, or when they seek out someone else who will readily confirm their illusions. Your quietness becomes a psychological mirror, and because people are terrified of seeing their own unacknowledged weakness, they will often flee from your presence or attempt to rewrite the history of your connection. You are left with the stark truth that seeing too much creates an irreversible distance, a psychological solitude that cannot be remedied by superficial adaptation. This brings you to an unresolved realization about the nature of human relationships and the collective psyche. You begin to suspect that much of what passes for intimacy is actually a mutual agreement to protect each other from the demands of consciousness. When you break this contract by simply seeing the truth and remaining silent, you accept the role of the outsider, the individual whose clarity threatens the comfortable sleep of the group. There is no triumph in this state, no sense of magical superiority or spiritual achievement, but rather a quiet, observational restraint. You stand at the boundary of your own life, fully aware of the hidden mechanisms operating in the room, watching the masks loosen in small moments of pressure, yet you make no move to fix, to change, or to rescue. You simply remain there, holding the tension of a truth that has opened before you, waiting to see what must psychologically die within the old structure before anything genuinely authentic can emerge.